Robin from Backscatter here, and today we're taking a look at part 4 of our best settings for the Olympus TG-5 series. In part 4, we'll be covering the best settings for shooting video. Here we've got our on the boat and in the water settings. For shooting video, our on the boat settings are going to be the same for both macro and wide angle, but there are some things we need to know in the water that apply specifically to wide angle or macro shooting exclusively, so we'll be covering each of those setups separately. Remember, the on the boat settings are pre-dive, while in the water settings are more variable and likely to be adjusted during your dive. We'll spend the rest of this video breaking these settings down and getting you set for success when shooting with your TG-5. Fortunately for us, because the on the boat settings are the same for both macro and wide angle, it makes it really easy to switch between shooting both styles on the same dive. The extent to which you'll be able to do so is primarily defined by the equipment you're using, whether that be a single or dual video lights, a wide angle lens, or a tripod. We'll be covering the reasons you need this gear and how it impacts each video style as we go along through this video. But first, let's cover some fundamental things that you need to know about shooting video before we get into the settings themselves. And when you get down to it, shooting video on the TG-5 is actually pretty simple. The key things we're going to pay attention to are exposure, color, focus, and stability. It's very important to get these things correct in camera since we're dealing with a compressed file output where these are baked into the clip itself. This is not like shooting in raw photo where we can make non-destructive changes to the file. Any heavy color, exposure, and stability editing in video will have much greater impact on the image quality than you would have on a raw photo, so get everything as accurate as you possibly can in camera. We often say, if the color isn't right, then nothing else matters, because the amount of correction required degrades the image quality to a point that we don't even want to use it anymore. The good news is that it's relatively easy to get everything right in camera, and with the tips and techniques in this video, you'll be nailing it in no time. Now, it's not that your footage has to be absolutely perfect. A certain degree of correction is always possible, but it is just one more step in the editing process, and even minor changes to color and exposure can cause that file to fall apart quickly. Now, this is true of all compressed video files, not just the TG-5, and it's really just kind of the nature of compressed file formats. Another major aspect of shooting video on the TG-5 is shooting in movie mode versus aperture priority and microscope modes. Now, while we are focusing on shooting video, our recommendation is to not shoot in movie mode. Fortunately for us, the TG-5 can record video in any mode, not just movie. Now, even though movie mode is the only way to shoot in 4K resolution or high frame rate 1080, we recommend using separate modes for macro and wide angle and sticking with just 1080 60p footage. We feel that there's just too many caveats that make movie mode less than ideal for shooting underwater video. For example, executing a manual white balance is critical for good underwater video color, but you cannot execute a manual white balance in movie mode. Now, you can choose from a previously set manual white balance from one of the photo modes, but if you want to change it, you have to rotate the mode dial to a photo mode, set that new manual white balance, and then rotate back to movie mode. Having to switch back and forth between modes to do this critical step really just feels cumbersome to us. Also, there's no ability to set the aperture value when shooting wide angle, so you could get some soft corners in a lot of your shots. Now, by shooting your video in either microscope mode for macro or aperture priority mode for wide angle instead, we can get even tighter macro, sharper wide angle, and we have more control over the color and final outcome of our image. Plus, we can still shoot at 60p and have the ability to do some slow motion shots. So, now that we have all those fundamental things out of the way, let's get into the settings themselves, starting with on the boat. These are going to be the same for both wide angle and macro. As a preliminary step, you can perform a full reset of your camera by following the steps on screen. This isn't required, but you may find that it makes it easier to follow along for the rest of the video. This reset will take your camera right back to its out-of-the-box state. Also, go ahead and set that mode dial to A for aperture priority. We'll come back to talking about this and why we use it in a minute, but for now, we just need to pick a mode to be in while we get our on-the-boat settings dialed in. First, we're gonna hit the menu button and go into the menus to find the video bitrate. Set this to super fine for the best image quality. Next, navigate to the live view boost and turn that on. This allows us to see a brighter preview on screen and to be able to more easily compose our shot. Next, we're gonna set our exposure. For photo, this is usually something that you change in the water, but for video, exposure is basically set and forget, allowing us to just set it once and not have to manage it in the water at all. It's just as simple as that. So the first exposure setting we'll adjust is our exposure compensation. Set your exposure compensation to minus 0.7 stops. This setting knocks down highlights, increases contrast, and better saturates the color in our footage. This makes our video look better when played back on an HD TV, which is often our end goal for displaying this footage. HD TVs tend to over-sharpen and over-contrast the image, leading to blown-out highlights and a loss of color. Our experience has shown us that by slightly underexposing the shot, we actually get better color, contrast, and detail in the final product. After that, we'll move to ISO and make sure that that is set to auto. This is going to allow the camera to determine the exposure automatically. Now, since we don't have direct shutter speed control, with the ISO set to auto and the exposure compensation set to minus 0.7, the TG-5 is going to put our exposure right in the range that we want. Between these two settings, we now have exposure dialed in, so just set it and forget it. Next, we'll bring up the quick menu and scroll to the options for frame rate and resolution. Set this to 1080 Full HD at 60p. We never want to shoot at less than 1920 by 1080 Full HD resolution because that's pretty much the standard for most devices nowadays. We prefer shooting at 60p or 60 frames per second because it allows you to either play back at 60 frames per second for that super fluid, lifelike motion, or slow that footage down by 50%, play it back at 30 frames per second, and get some cool slow motion effects. Now, this is something that we use all the time for underwater video. That's probably the most often used technique in the underwater video editing playbook because it helps smooth out and stabilize your clip, and it doubles the duration, giving you twice as much content to work with. From here, we'll go to our aspect ratio settings. Set this to 16 by 9. We set this because we're shooting video in two of the photo modes, which otherwise would display at 4/3 aspect ratio. The TG-5 only captures video in 16 by 9, so we're not reducing the size or the area of the video being captured. Rather, we're just making our on-screen preview appear exactly how our shot is going to appear. If you do switch back and forth between shooting photo and video a lot, you might find it easier to just stick to that 4/3 ratio and anticipate the 16 by 9 crop when you hit the record button. We find that when going out for dedicated video shooting, it's just easier to frame your shot by working entirely in 16 by 9. After that, we'll scroll to autofocus, and we're just gonna keep that set to autofocus. Use a half press of the shutter button to activate and acquire focus. Next up is in-camera image stabilization, but there is something a little tricky here to be aware of. You don't want to get fooled by the still image stabilization and the movie image stabilization. Movie IS is only available in the movie mode quick menu, even if you're shooting video in one of the photo modes. The still IS feature found in the quick menu on the photo modes does nothing when rolling video clips. This is a really goofy thing and something that you want to be aware of. So just go into movie mode, bring up the quick menu, ensure that movie IS is on, which it will be by default, and then never worry about it again. Everything that we just set is going to stay the same regardless of what mode we're in. So that means our pre-dive on the boat settings are complete. Let's move on to our in the water settings and everything you need to manage color, focus, and stability in both wide angle and macro. Now we're gonna cover our wide angle setup first, and then we'll move on to macro. Since we're already in aperture priority mode, we can just leave that mode dial right where it is. We use aperture priority for the sharpest corners and the most control over our depth of field. In order to get those sharp corners in our wide angle shots, we need to set our aperture to f8. This really doesn't have anything to do with the exposure because the camera is already making its mind up automatically on that. Rather, this is for guaranteeing corner sharpness when using that wide angle accessory lens. Remember, zoom affects the aperture value on the camera. So if you're unable to get to that f8 setting, just back off that zoom control all the way. The microscope mode on this camera automatically zooms in just a little bit. So if you're frequently swapping from macro to wide angle, you'll see the aperture default to f9 in aperture priority mode when coming from microscope mode. This is totally fine exposure-wise. You just want to be sure to check that zoom level to make sure that you are actually shooting the widest shot possible and that you're not inadvertently cropping your wide field of view because you're zoomed in just that little bit. And when shooting wide angle, you will need a wide angle lens. Wide angle lenses allow us to get close to our subjects, minimizing the water we have to shoot through and giving us better color, contrast, and clarity in our image. The best bet for the TG-5 is the Backscatter M52 wide angle lens. It expands the field of view from 60 to 120 degrees underwater with sharp corners and no vignetting even at the camera's widest setting. You do have to burp the lens, but only once at the start of your dive, and this is true for every wet lens out there, not just this one. Of course, you do have to make sure the shade is rotated so that the large portion of the shade is in the top and the bottom position, or that 12:6 position, otherwise it is going to show up in your image. Exposure compensation and ISO are already set, so our exposure is dialed in already. Let's get color figured out, which will also cover most of what we need to know about lighting too. And we're gonna dig deep into this subject because good color really is probably the most important single aspect to understand about underwater video. Like we say, if that color isn't right, then nothing else matters. We're gonna use the white balance setting to get our color set. White balance is how we tell the camera what the neutral baseline color should be. The camera will then build the rest of the colors off of that neutral baseline. When shooting wide angle, there's really two ways to light the shot, either with video lights or only natural ambient light. Video lights have a much higher and warmer color temperature than ambient light, which has a lower and cooler color temperature underwater. Shooting ambient light only is the simplest and easiest way to get into wide angle underwater video. Your entire shot is going to have the same color temperature. Shooting with video lights will have a few more considerations, so we're going to tackle shooting ambient light only first. When underwater, we're mainly compensating for a loss of the color red as the sunlight comes down through the blue water column. As we descend deeper, everything becomes more blue, or the color temperature keeps getting cooler and cooler the deeper we go. This is because we're losing more of that warm red as we go deeper. Now to compensate for this color loss, we execute a manual white balance. To set a manual white balance, bring up the quick menu. Scroll over to one of the 4 manual banks, hit the info button, hit the shutter button to set it, and then confirm the selection. For the best color results underwater, set the white balance to your hand, the sand, or some dead patch of reef. These are the kind of neutral subjects that we want to be establishing our baseline with. We'll have to set a new manual white balance for every 10 feet in depth that we change in the water. This is because of that cooler color temperature and that loss of red as we go deeper. The TG-5 has 4 banks to store manual white balances, so use them for different depths or shooting with or without lights. When shooting wide with ambient light only, the ideal range for executing a manual white balance is anywhere from the surface to about 40 feet. 40 to 50 feet is where ambient light results start to get a little mixed, though they will be better on a sunny, clear day. Between 50 to 60 feet and below is where almost all the red in the water is gone, and you really need to switch over to using lights because the camera will no longer be able to execute a good ambient light only manual white balance. When shooting wide angle ambient light, keep that sun at your back. It's the brightest thing in our solar system after all, so think of it as your great big video light in the sky. If you balance to just the ambient light and then you introduce a much warmer video light source, your lights will appear overly red due to their warmer color temperature. So this is why we either balance entirely to our lights or entirely to just the ambient natural light. So what about color correction filters? Well, a red filter can help improve the color range of the TG-5, allowing you to get more accurate colors at deeper depths. Filters do reduce the amount of light coming in through the lens, so the camera will compensate by raising the ISO, increasing the noise in your image, bringing that quality down a little bit. There's no practical way to use an external red filter and a wide-angle lens at the same time, so you really have to use a gel filter inside the housing, meaning that it's locked in there for the entire dive. Now, this is totally fine if you're only shooting ambient light wide angle, but if you introduce any artificial lights, they're gonna appear overly red. So feel free to use a filter if you wanna increase the natural light color range at depth, but that's really the only application for a filter on this camera. So that's ambient light. Now let's cover video lights. Using dual video lights will create a look that's more like that of a lit still photo, with a lit foreground and a more extreme difference in our color temperature between foreground and background. Now, the challenge of using video lights is maintaining a close and consistent distance to your subject. With video lights, you're basically locked to about a 2-foot range to your foreground subject. That's about the effective limit for even the best underwater video lights. They just really don't travel that far through the water, and they definitely don't have the same range as strobes for still shooting, which are way brighter than even the brightest video lights. When balancing to your video lights, you really have to knock out all the ambient light from the shot. Otherwise, your lights are just gonna look too red. The best way to do this is to get just inches off the sand, bring those lights in close so that only light you're seeing in the frame is from your video lights. Then set your white balance and you're good to go. With video lights, you really don't need to rebalance at different depths. Since we're balanced to the lights, we're taking that same color with us even as we move deeper. One good technique is to store a white balance with your lights in one of those 4 banks on the camera, and then keep the other 3 for different ambient light only depths. At deeper depths, it will be easier to see your video light because there's less ambient light for them to compete with. At shallower depths, with much more ambient light, it's harder to overpower those ambient conditions. What we really recommend is saving your lights for those deeper shots and just using the bright ambient light conditions for shallower shots. The brighter the power setting on your lights, the farther that they're able to travel through the water. Most of the time, you're going to be shooting at full power, so we recommend just starting there. Adjust your power level as needed for the shot, but the brighter they are, the better of a job those lights are gonna do at knocking out all that ambient light, so that's why we recommend just starting them and probably keeping them at full power. For wide angle, keep your lights above that center line of the lens and pull them back behind the edges of the lens as well. Always try to maintain an equal distance between your lights and the lens and the subject in the lens. Keeping this equal distance triangle is the key to avoiding backscatter and lighting up all that stuff in the water between your camera and your subject. One thing we love about shooting video as opposed to shooting stills is that you get a constant preview on screen of your shot in real time, which makes it super easy to check your lighting and shadows. Unlike shooting stills, where you have to shoot, review, adjust, and then repeat just to get dialed in, video shows you exactly what's going on in the moment. So that's our color and lighting all taken care of. Now we can move on to focus. When shooting wide angle, focus on the foreground or the closest element in the frame. The best wide angle shots always have a sharp foreground. Use the half press of the shutter to focus, then compose your shot from there. That's basically all there is to it for simple and effective autofocus. On occasion, some clips can be subject to quick little focus hunts. Now sometimes you can edit around these, but sometimes they're right in the middle of an epic clip. So check out our advanced settings video for more info about alternative focus modes on this camera and how to avoid those little focus hunts. Stability is pretty simple to get figured out. In-camera stabilization is pretty great, but it really only helps you out so much. Instead, it's up to you to get that shot stable. Using just your hands on the housing with no handles is really kind of the worst because there's just no inherent stability with that. Adding a single handle to your system helps and makes a huge difference over having none, but having two handles is way better, and when you're shooting really wide, you can get your grip way out there and just hold on to your lights. The wider your grip, the more stable the footage will be, so use this to your advantage. As far as composing the shot goes, don't use the zoom at all when shooting wide angle because you're cropping in on your field of view. This eliminates the point of shooting wide in the first place. When shooting wide, zoom with your fins, not your camera. And just like that, you are now completely set for shooting wide angle video. Now let's switch it up and move over to macro. Set the camera to microscope mode for the closest working distance and the tightest macro shots possible. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This is the coolest thing about the TG-5, so use this feature. Our exposure is already dialed in because that exposure compensation and ISO are already set. Things are a little different on the color and lighting side when it comes to shooting macro. For beginning shooters that don't want to mess with all that white balance stuff, just set the white balance to auto. This works great for macro because our goals are to get close to our subject and to completely knock out all ambient light on our subject, only getting exposure from our video light. However, we do recommend using a manual white balance because the camera can default to a slightly yellow color cast when set to auto. You can't really use a color correction filter for shooting macro instead of using a light, since we're using that light not just for color, but to actually illuminate and get some exposure on our subject. Most macro critters like their dark holes and shadowed ledges, otherwise they become food. But rarely is there enough ambient light to shoot them without help from a video light in the first place, let alone when you add a filter into the mix, and the colors really just aren't gonna pop without that video light. The working distance to your subject is always relative, but you should always get as close as you need to in order to fill the frame. For macro and microscope mode, we generally start just a few inches away and then we push in close to get really tight. With microscope mode, you have no minimum working distance, so get as close as your subject will physically allow you to. Remember, no ambient light at all in your macro scene. Get in tight and fill that frame with only the light from your video light. When shooting macro, you will need at least one video light, as like I was saying earlier, most macro subjects are hidden in dark nooks and crannies, and we're aiming for total artificial light coverage. We need these colors to pop on our subjects. We prefer using only one video light to shoot macro subjects, since that helps preserve some shadow underneath the subject and it gives it some texture and the ability to kind of stand out from the scene. Now, I like having two lights on my system so I can just quickly swap lighting from left to right, plus I have a backup light just in case. When shooting macro, we like using a light with both a spot beam and a flood beam. A flood beam allows you to blanket a huge area, but a spot beam concentrates that brightness right on the subject for tighter shots. This concentration of brightness really helps when knocking out all that ambient light. We almost always want our lights set to full power unless we're completely blowing out the scene. For macro, keep that light above the subject and aiming down and forward. Most of the time, you're gonna be super close to the subject, so when you need to, you just kinda have to mash that light down in there where you need it. A macro pro tip is to mask out the red metal bezel on the Olympus PT-058 housing. Sometimes this red bezel can reflect back in your shot and give you kind of a weird red color cast in those super close shots. I like to mask it out with either just a black marker or a step-up ring. Compose your shot by using your zoom control liberally and get in there as tight as you possibly can. As you're composing your shot, consider your focus. Macro shooting requires focus on areas of critical detail. Most often, this is the eyeball of your subject, so always achieve focus on that and then compose your shot from there. Stability has a much more noticeable impact on macro video because the shots we're after are super tight. We strongly recommend the use of a tripod. Even just the slightest amount of handshake during macro video can make the viewer feel seasick. Since we're dealing with those super tight shots, there's pretty much no room for movement in there. Using a tripod is what gives you that rock solid stability, and it's really the way that you want to go when shooting macro. We prefer the Joby GorillaPod when shooting with the TG-5 because it's a small, lightweight, adaptable tripod that mounts directly to the bottom of the housing. Of course, when using a tripod, always be cautious of your environment. Never ever use a tripod on the reef. Only put it down in the sand or somewhere non-destructive. And no matter what, please be aware of your environment and just be a good diver. Place the tripod, get your shot all set, then back off and take your hands off the housing. This will avoid any shaky hands killing that stability, and it often allows that critter that you're after to come out of their hiding spot a little more than they would if there was some gargantuan bubble-blowing monster right there in their face. As an alternative to a tripod, you can always just set the housing down in the sand and get face-to-face with critters at that level. Basically, any way that you can rest the housing to achieve stability without harming the environment is fine. We just prefer using the tripod to make that a little easier. So there you go, now you're all set for macro. See, whether you're shooting wide angle or macro, it all really just comes down to exposure, color, focus, and stability. Now that you know what goes into those things for each shooting style, your video master training is almost complete. Let's wrap it up with some general video shooting tips and tricks. Always leave some room at either end of your clip. You want to pre-roll before the action or that crucial moment, and then keep rolling for a few beats after the action's over. These serve as a nice little buffer room on either end for applying transitions during your edit, and they help ensure that you don't accidentally cut a clip too soon, like right in the middle of the action. Also, let your subjects leave the frame on their own. A great editing technique is to have your subject make a graceful stage exit rather than just abruptly ending a clip while they're still swimming through the middle of it. Always be shooting to a sequence. The easiest to remember is wide, medium, tight. Get an establishing shot that shows the whole scene. Then bring it in to get closer with your subject, and then go tight for nice detail. This works great for both macro and wide, and it gives you a nice little sequence to edit together. Keep these tips and tricks in mind, and you'll thank us when you're hunched over your keyboard editing your footage later. Congratulations, you are now a master of wide angle and macro video on the Olympus TG-5. Stay tuned for the rest of this series, and please feel free to reach out to us here at Backscatter if you need any help with your TG-5 or anything else underwater photo or video related. We dive, shoot, and service everything we sell, and we're always happy to help out. I'm Robin from Backscatter signing off, and hey, don't forget to grease your O-ring too.